Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Asaf Ramarowski, the Executive Director of SPME, and it is my pleasure to once again welcome you to our SPME webinars. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity to hear from our friend and colleague, Gadi Taub, who is coming to us from Israel and will talk to us about Israel and American foreign policy in the Middle East. Gadi is a prolific scholar and public intellectual. He's written a great deal on these topics. He's worked here in the States and in Israel. His podcast with Mike Doran on these very issues is quite well known and is worth listening to all over the place. He really has his pulse on a lot of the issues, especially as we are looking at the current election cycle here in the States, and obviously as we're tracking everything in Israel regarding the war and the politics involved with everything else. His full bio is listed on the invitation. The format will go as follows. Those of you who have been with us in the past know, Gadi will talk for about 15, 20 minutes. Then we will go into Q&A. Questions should be put into the chat, and I will do my best to get to all of them. If we do not, we apologize in advance, and we will do our best to respond. You can email us after the webinar, and we'll do our best to respond after the webinar itself. So really, without further ado, Gadi, thank you for joining us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, Asaf. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here and speak with your audience. And I think the thing that we need to understand if we are to get into the question of American Middle Eastern policy and vis-a-vis Israel especially, is that we are fed a false version of what is going on. And this version is very effective in catching the Israeli audience and also many American Jews. So I'll start with the propaganda. The State Department is telling Israelis and telling American Jews that if Israel just moves back to the two-state solution track, then we will have Saudi Arabia joining in with normalization, and after that, we can all join in a coalition of the Sunnis, the Israelis, and the Americans, and possibly some Europeans, to isolate and contain Iran. This is a pie in the sky. First of all, because American foreign policy in the region is doing the exact opposite. So the problem with this narrative, to which I will return shortly, begins with the fact that it portrays the American stance in a completely misleading way. And this is crucial because this administration is presenting its own policy to the whole American public in fraudulent terms. The two Democratic administrations, or maybe three, the two Obama administrations, and now the Biden administration, and possibly, God forbid, another Democratic administration that will continue this policy. Their policy is an attempt to reach accommodation with Iran over Israel's head. This is a progressive version of a long-standing stance in the State Department. The State Department, as you probably recall, did not want the United States to recognize the State of Israel in 1948. It thought that America is making a serious mistake in orienting itself towards Israel, whereas its most vital interests lie with the Arab country, and especially with their oil industry. And so backing Israel in the Arab-Israeli conflict thought the State Department was a serious mistake. And this tendency became even stronger in the State Department after the Yom Kippur War, when the Arab League began its embargo on selling oil to anyone who supports Israel. But luckily, the Nixon-Kissinger team of that time was more far-sighted. And as you recall, this was the height of the Cold War. And what they understood Kissinger brilliantly. If you read his memoirs, he oriented his policy with great patience towards the moment where he thought an Arab state would break rank. And his analysis was as follows. He thought that since the Soviets are backing their Arab allies in their most extreme position, they will be able to give them nothing because they demand a total withdrawal from all territories that Israel conquered in the 6 Days War without getting any, as a condition to negotiations. Israel, they demand from Israel to renounce all its strategic assets before the negotiation begins. So it's a non-starter for Israel. So the only way that something can be achieved for their Arab clients, the Soviets can only achieve it through war. And if there is another war, then America would not let Soviet arms triumph over American arms. So Kissinger figured this chessboard very wisely to be set for a betrayal, but by one of the Arab players in this league. And indeed, this is what happened. After the Yom Kippur War, Anwar Sadat realized that the only way that he could get anything territorially from Israel is by deserting the Soviet camp and aligning himself with the American-led Western coalition at the price of a peace accord with Israel. The State Department, as I said, did not share Kissinger's view, and luckily Kissinger and Nixon imposed theirs, and this was part of their Cold War game, because that enabled them eventually to push the Soviets out of their advantageous position in the Middle East. So that's the history, over which now we have a progressive view, and the progressive view, as it's formulated by State Department, the Obama administration and the Biden administration, is called by the fancy name disintegration. Its catchword is de-escalation. Sorry, I said disintegration. I should have said regional integration. It's de-escalation and regional integration. And regional integration, ask yourself, who is to be integrated? And since they answer that question, if you dig just a little, then you understand what they are getting at. As former President Obama said, the Saudis and the Sunnis will have to learn to share the neighborhoods with the Shiites of Iran. So this policy now in the new formulation assumes that the problem that the United States has in the Middle East is that it's repeatedly being dragged into wars. And what is dragging them into wars is the fact that they are backing their allies. It is their allies who are sucking them into the Middle East and forcing them to take part in wars in which America has no vested interest. So according to this analysis, what America should do in order to pull out of the Middle East is to restrain its allies and position its and to pacify its enemies, because its allies are already on their side. And so we just need to reach out to those who aren't, and position itself as an objective mediator in order to strike a new balance between the Sunnis and the Shiites. Phrasing all this less politely, this is a policy of appeasing Iran. It has failed miserably, because we now have almost 4 years of experience with that. And when you look back at what they did, and you look at what the Middle East looks like now, Iran was at heel when the Trump administration left office. They were almost out of financial reserves, and they were unable to support their proxy proxy forces all over the Middle East to an extent that would make them able to weaponize them effectively. So I interviewed Secretary Pompeo after he left office and asked him what the difference was between the Trump administration policy in the Middle East and the Obama administration that preceded it. It was just after he left office. And he said there were three legs to the policy. It was on my Hebrew podcast. And there were three legs to the policy. One, Iran is the problem, not the solution. Secondly, the Palestinian veto must be bypassed. And thirdly, there needs to be a credible threat of force. That is, the United States has to have a force large enough in the area in order to deter its enemies. When the Biden administration, so the Trump administration, sorry, also wanted to pull out of the Middle East, but its policy was the exact opposite. It thought that in order to pull out of the Middle East, in order not to get entangled in further wars, you need to deter Iran, not appease Iran. And what you should do is strengthen and back your allies and tame Iran rather than attempt to pacify it. Now, when the Biden administration came back to power, or the Democrats came back to power with the Biden administration, what they first tried to do was return to the disastrous JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. A lot of people are saying that it was a mistake to leave it because the Iranians started to enrich uranium to a higher grade. If you actually look at the tables, at the timetables, I took mine from Roger Greenway, who was a former Pentagon official, and you can see that the minute they started enriching uranium to a higher grade was November 2020, when after they were certain that that Biden has won the presidency. It was then that they began enriching uranium to a military grade. So the minute you give up deterrence, this is what happens. But if you look at generally at what the Biden administration did, apart from attempting to appease Iran in returning to the JCPOA, which they tried to satisfy them and failed. One, they loosened the sanction regime. And so they basically gave the Iranians a new economic leash on life. They have managed to amass something like, to fill their coffers with something like $100 billion, most of the money because sanctions against oil sales to China were loosened. And then there were the unfreezing of assets, which didn't stop after October 7th. But this is just part of the picture. The first thing, their first foreign policy thing that they did when they entered the White House was take the Houthis out of the list of terror organizations and then ban attack weapons, as if there's a big difference between attack and defense here. But they prevented the Saudis from effective weapons with which to fight the Houthis. They then did the same to Israel, and Israelis don't realize that. When you say that to Israel, the Israelis, you say, compare. What did they do vis-a-vis Saudis, the Saudis and the Houthis, and what did they do vis-a-vis Israel and Hezbollah? They did the same thing. They forced Israel when there was how should I put it mildly, a prime minister here that is not very well versed in international relations, a journalist called Yair Lapid. They forced him to give up oil fields in the sea and Israeli territorial water in order to appease Hezbollah. Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, said that this was one of the most striking victories that Hezbollah ever had, because it took from Israel everything it wanted in this negotiation without even the threat of force. So he said, we are now big enough as players that Israelis fear us. But the truth is that the Israelis just trusted the Americans rather than feared Hezbollah. And how well this agreement that we were told would bring peace and quiet to our northern border, what does it look like now? What it really was is the Americans attempting to signal to Tehran that we will protect your proxies. And this happened again when the war began. When the war began, Biden gave his don't speech. And if you recall this speech, he said, if there is any state or organization that is thinking about taking advantage of this situation created after October 7th, I have one word for them: don't. And Israelis heard state Iran, organization Hezbollah. But Biden himself made clear, it was reported in the Israeli press, that he also meant by state Israel and the IDF, and that the Americans put their foot down that in order to prevent a preemptive strike on Hezbollah. Whether it was a smart thing to do to try to preempt Hezbollah or not, I don't have an opinion, because for this you need an actual knowledge of the actual size of our force. But according to most indications, the IDF was not ready for a war on two fronts. So good for us that the Americans came here with two, not one, aircraft carriers, and prevented the war from escalating in the north. But why didn't they do it? For them, if this war spreads to a full-out war with Hezbollah, then the whole appeasement of Iran collapses. And so the interests of the United States and Israel here converged, but they stopped converging when it comes to Gaza. And we now know there was almost a full embargo on weapons to Israel. What the press tell us is just not true. I just interviewed a week ago. I'm now editing on my premiere editing program here some promos to that interview that's already aired with a member of Knesset, Amit Halevi, Likud, who sits on the Israeli Foreign Relations and Security Committee of the Knesset, and he knows this step by step. So we now know that the Americans tried to prevent us from entering from the ground incursion of Gaza when it was the beginning of the war. Then they attempted to prevent the occupation of Gaza City. They then attempted to prevent us from getting into Khan Yunis. And then, as everyone knows, they tried to put their foot down and prevent us from entering Rafah. And then it became clear, manifest, acknowledged that they were withholding weapons in order to threaten us. And it was then that it was a head-on clash between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Joe Biden and Secretary Blinken, and Israel went into Rafah. Then the United States objected to us occupying the Philadelphia corridor, and we now know that there are at least 150 tunnels, some of them large enough for Hummer vehicles to drive in, which was a highway of smuggling of weapons into Gaza. And so the United States eventually is trying to do, now with the hostage deal, by the way, is trying to do the same that it did with the Houthis and the Hezbollah. It is trying to prevent the complete destruction of Hamas, in the hope that if Israel does not achieve complete victory and does not occupy the Gaza Strip, then they will be able to return us to the two-state solution track. And this, to go back to Secretary Pompeo's analysis, this means they are trying to bring back the Palestinian veto, because far from helping us to organize a coalition against Iran, they are sticking to their own policy of regional integration, in which if we are bogged down with endless negotiations with the Palestinians, then there would be no coalition to counter Iran. The coalition that was the Abraham Accords. When Biden entered the White House, the State Department forbade its officials to call them the Abraham Accords. And they started saying we should enlarge them and bring in the Palestinians. Bringing in the Palestinians means that the Abraham Accords will disintegrate, because it will force the Arabs to demand a Palestinian state. Israel would never agree to, and certainly after October 7th, to anything like a two-state solution now, or a Palestinian state. And so this will sabotage rather than enable a coalition against Iran. So to sum up, in their view, what they are trying to do now, and for this, I recommend reading Mike Doran and Tony Badran's classic by now piece, The Realignment. It appears on the Tablet website. But you can listen to weekly analysis of all this. I think my co-host of the Israel Update podcast, which is featured on Tablet too, Mike Doran, is probably the best analyst of these matters. He is a former official of the National Security Council. He was at the White House under George W. Bush. And so Mike says, and I think rightly, that if we look at it through their eyes, they think that this Gaza war is the one festering area where Iran's power is seriously challenged. And once this war is wound down, they can, now the catchphrase is prevent a regional war. But what it means is de-escalation in the north. That means that Israel would have to acquiesce to the existence of a huge neo-Nazi army on our border in the north. I'm telling you right now, people will not return home to the north. The north will remain empty as long as Hezbollah is perched on our northern border. And it also means that Iran will be left alone now to complete its military nuclear program. So this is the crossroads where we are. And if we have another American administration that would continue this policy, this is an existential danger to the future of the state of Israel. So that's, I hope this is, I tried to do a lot in a short time. I hope that it's still clear. I'll be happy to clear and also to argue, you know, I'm Israeli, with anyone who has questions or objections to this interpretation.
Great, thank you for that. There's a lot to discuss, and thank you for, we need to unpack a lot of this. And there are a lot of questions. Alex, I'm going to let you start off with the first question, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Well, first, thanks very much for a very wide-ranging, as you say, rapid tour of the scene, and it raises all sorts of questions for me, both kind of historical and also contemporary or related to contemporary politics. But one thing that's always puzzled me, and I wrote a little bit about this a number of years ago during the Obama administration, and then that's the question of what is the source of Obama's interest in reorienting American policy towards the Middle East. And I had throughout a number of theories about his desire to see authentic Islamic governance succeed someplace in the Middle East, and that was his support for also the source of his support for the Muslim Brotherhood regime. But I'm wondering what you think about this. Why the reorientation, and why then?
Yeah, so as I said, this is a long-standing school in American diplomacy, but certainly the Obama administration had a progressive take on that, and you could see this emerging I remember it was 2009, and we all listened with, you know, perked up ears to his speech in Cairo.
Speech, right.
In which he basically gave the Edward Said interpretation of the Middle East, the need to apologize before the indigenous people for Western arrogance, the need to reach out, the need to make amends. All this, Israelis understood, is going to be at our expense. And also this same frame of mind, well, you know, first of all, this frame of mind that it is the woke frame of mind has replaced the idea of good and evil with the idea of strong and weak. I translated to Hebrew a brilliant exposition of this issue by Batya Unger-Sargon, who spoke on the Telos webinar. I'll gladly post a link to that in the Q&A here, in which he explained how American and Western feminists sided with Hamas rapists against their Jewish victims, and how crazy that is. And her analysis said that the woke frame of mind classifies people to powerful and powerless, and whoever is coded as white is considered powerful, and whoever is non-white is powerless. And so the powerful are always guilty, and the powerless just react blindly to oppression. And so under this frame of mind, it was clear that Israel is being coded not just as white, but also as the last vestige of colonialism. And there is no way that we can, within this frame of mind, make our case. This frame of interpretation makes Israel a pariah in advance. And this goes on. And if you've been to an American university in the last 2 decades, maybe 3 decades, then you would know that within the framework of post-colonial studies, there is no way to defend Zionism without violating your methodological assumptions. It's a rigged game in such a way that if you side with Zionism, you're automatically a racist and a colonialist. And this, in my opinion, it began long ago. So when I teach American history, sometimes I wish I could do it more. Israelis are not that interested, especially woke universities are not. But I would pin it on 2 years before the preceding Democratic Convention in Chicago. That is 66, 2 years before 68, when Stockley Carmichael took over SNCC, the student arm of Martin Luther King's civil rights movement, and began to tip it in the direction of Black power. And then you begin to see the rhetoric that Zionism is a form of colonialism and that Blacks should identify with Islam and all the rest of it. Obama comes from these circles. There was just recently an expose by David Samuels in Tablet, where he shows that Obama lied about why he broke up with his white Asian girlfriend when he lived in Chicago, because he keeps saying that she was not supportive enough of Black activism, but there's also her side of the story, and her side of the story is that he refused to criticize a rampant anti-Semitic social activist who was spreading blood libels against Jews, and she couldn't stand it because she's a daughter of Hasidei Umot HaOlam, of people who rescued Jews in Europe in the Second World War. So the Obama frame of mind is that frame of mind, and note, it's not just anti-Israeli, it's anti-American. And I know I'm saying this, it sounds provocative, but if you think of the recent Democratic convention, there was a speech by Obama then. And what was his speech? His speech was about how every group who comes to America suffered abuse, slavery, racism, prejudice, and it was beaten, spat at. He had a very colorful description of what happened to everyone who came to America. And you listen to this speech and you ask yourself, well, who is the agent of all this oppression? Well, it's America. So America is this evil that oppresses anyone that comes there. So when he talked about the fundamental transformation of America, it's renouncing Americanism, basically. And you look now, you look at Kamala Harris, and she is quoted on an Iranian website saying that America is imperialistic and colonial and whatnot. And guess what? I did my Ph.D. at Rutgers University, and there were about 30 to 35 candidates in my class, and we went through 2 years of courses as American universities offer in their PhD programs. And in my class, there are only 2 people that were willing to say anything good about America, anything at all. And this was myself and a Japanese student who came to do diplomatic history. So this is the atmosphere in which, this is the Edward Said frame of mind. And we need to stop pretending that it's only anti-Semitic. It's also anti-American. Look at the demonstrations in Chicago now. Is anyone in those on the progressive circles carrying an American flag ever? Is anyone in the protest in Columbia University carrying an American flag? No, they're burning it, or at least the radical Palestinian contingent is. So I think that there's a traditional policy juxtaposed over which is a progressive version with at least a suspicion towards anything American.
Alex, you have a follow-up, or
Well, it's interesting in that sense how this, we'll use the term for progressive for shorthand, as shorthand. It meshes with the traditional, so to speak, State Department view of Israel as an impediment and an aberration that goes back 75, even 80, almost 80 years now, even though all the individuals, George Marshall and his circles are and the Arabists who were written about famously in the 1970s, all of those people are now long gone from the scene, but they've been effectively replaced by successive generations who come out of the university world, but also come out of the NGO world and the foundation world, all of which are a big revolving door situation. But they arrive at the same conclusions, that the existence of a Jewish state and Jewish sovereignty is an aberration, and it's an example of American colonialism, or imperialism and imperial imposition. But at the same time, the imperialist dissemination of post-colonial ideology and this post-colonial mentality that America always knows best is another constant thread from George Marshall until through it, in a perverse way, through Edward Said and to the present.
I concur with this interpretation of what happened to American foreign policy, and I suggested, my last book in Hebrew, unfortunately only in Hebrew, it's in the process of translation, but events, I can't catch up with events which are in the last 2 or 3 years are very relevant to the theme of my book, but I'm going to call it a globalist elites and national citizens. And I think that this anti-national, eventually anti-patriotic spirit we can see it all over the West, and always it deals with the same issues. So if you look at what's happening in the United States and what's happening in Israel, and you think about the connections between, say, the anti-Bibi demonstrations and the American administration, they are positively encouraging the street riots against Netanyahu. And if you look at the agendas of the Democratic administration in the United States and the anti-Bibi crowd in Israel, then one of their pet issues is illegal immigration. Israel has been through a struggle over judicial reform that convulsed the country for something like 8 months. But the height of it was in the beginning of 1923, after this government came to power, and the judicial reform was an attempt at democratizing Israel, because Israel is not exactly a democracy. It's a juristocracy. We have a Supreme Court that exercises final authority over any action of the other branches of government. People don't realize how radical this is. When I say every action, I mean every action, whatever, from appointments to legislation to amending this semi-constitution that we have. So we have a court not sitting and exercising judicial review according to a constitution. It's exercising judicial review over the formation of a constitution. It has final say over the rules of the game, and it has positioned itself over in a position of authority over the elected branches of government. And there was a huge struggle over this in Israel. And one of the key issues in which the court is forcing Israel's hand is illegal immigration. Israel has a population of illegal immigrants from Africa. The court is putting obstacles in the way in every attempt of the state to stem that tide. And if you look at what is going on elsewhere in the West, so you see that the George Soros foundations, which have parallels here in human rights NGOs, are fighting to enable illegal immigration. And if you look at the woke in the United States, they are fighting to enable illegal immigration. So these sections of the populations, mostly they're mostly elite. They're mostly the upper echelons of the social economic ladder, are undermining the idea of citizenship and the idea of nationalism, of the legitimate right of national self-determination. So the attempt to impose on Israel a return to the two-state solution, and the attempt to topple the Netanyahu government, and the attempt to encourage the forces that encourage illegal immigration, are all tied together. So the American administration has allies within Israel, and I've been, they have been saying it. So when I say this, people are surprised. But these people rioting in the middle of a war, they say that the big enemy is not Hamas, it is Netanyahu. And this is amazing, because maybe Americans can understand this because of the part of the anti-Trump, what do they call it? The Trump derangement syndrome is we call it BDS, the Bibi derangement syndrome, is the same here. And these elites here also are, if not explicitly, then at least implicitly anti-national. They would like to see Israel turn into what they call the state of all its citizens, and they are the local branch of globalism here in Israel, in the midst of the Middle East.
Let me ask you a question, just to kind of, to your last point. I mean, you teach American history to Israelis, and you raise an interesting points that, obviously Alex and I and many of us have come across. And you go back in your points to the Obama administration. It seems like there was not a full understanding of the danger and a full understanding of the American left inside Israeli society. And so, can you comment about that? I mean, there is an understanding in the American Jewish community. There has been a very kind of a love of the idea of the concept of a two-state solution. But when you go into Israeli society, there is and this was part of what you're seeing today, as far as the erosion of the bipartisanship that we've seen within the Democratic Party, that had a lot more historical pro-Israel viewpoints that no longer exists, as we're seeing now with the DNC. But there seems a hypersensitive focus within the Israeli architecture on the larger threat of Iran, but not understanding, the ideologies of the left, of the new left, and understanding, apropos your earlier comments about 68 within Israeli society, which is, to my mind, contributes to the lost in translation. I mean, how are you seeing, do Israelis fully understand the danger of what these viewpoints are? and where they come from, which, to your point about, Obama and Obama's Cairo speech, it seemed like Israelis were caught, with their pants, down, without understanding the threat of Obama and what Obama represented, and how it all played out.
Yeah, so first of all, the Obama administration and the Biden administration are very smart at manipulating Israelis. They tell Israelis what they want to hear. If you and you see this repeated endlessly in the Israeli press. Whenever the Biden administration is attacked for its Israel policy, they say, "What do you mean? There has never been in the history of the United States a president who rushed to Israel in the midst of a war in order to reassure it that we have their back." And Israelis buy that because they have an emotional need to buy that. A lot of our sense of security relies on the United States, and within the left, this goes much further, because at least after the collapse of the Oslo Accords, which is already in 94 when they began to fray, Israeli public support for the two-state solution has been declining. And the left, which thinks that this is the only way to save Zionism from binationalism or from drowning in an Arab majority between the river and the sea, the left has given up on persuading the Israeli electorates. And so they have shifted their wishful thinking to an idea that America will save us by imposing on us the right thing to do. So this was also the rhetoric that the Americans began to use. The late Martin Indyk on his Twitter feed kept saying, America is the adult in the room. Everybody knows the only solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is partition. And so we would have to force you to do it. And the left embraced that fully. And this is very worrying, because what was Zionism about? Zionism was about returning agency to the Jewish people. It's about the Jewish people having their own state and becoming, as our Declaration of Independence says, masters of our own fate. And these people are willing to just hand over our sovereignty to the federal government of the United States. And they're even cocky about it. So if you read, say, a guy named Ami Dror, as opposed to Yaakov Amidror, which is, Amidror is one word. He was in the National Security Council. But this Ami Dror is one of the leaders of the anti-reform and the anti-Bibi protest. And he keeps bragging in their own WhatsApp groups, they leak, that he is receiving orders from the White House, that they're in contact, and that don't worry, the Americans are putting this floating pier in order to internationalize the conflict and in order to undermine the Israeli government's ability to conduct policy by undermining our sovereignty. And he celebrates that because finally the good people, the adults, the well-meaning, worldly Americans are going to come and save us from ourselves. So there is a deep anti, or at least non-democratic tendency in the left to happily hand over our sovereignty to someone else. And so you see it all the time in the press when, and I have these arguments on Twitter all the time, when I say this American administration is undermining Israel's vital interests, and they say, no, they're supporting Israel's interests. They're undermining Netanyahu's government, which they consider a positive thing. But if you look at this statement, then their view is not that that the government should be replaced by a democratic vote. It would be replaced by the adults in the room overriding Israel's democratic vote. And they don't realize that once you give up the sovereignty of your own government, then you lose the state sovereignty, because this is the government of the state. There is no other.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Richard's question here in the Q&A, and obviously people have more questions. You can type them in via the chat. So, Richard, is asking, to your point. I mean, so with everything that we're describing here, how is it possible, again, that there's still within the American Jewish community a kind of a religiosity, a kind of a theological, I'm adding that word to the Democratic Party. I mean, how do you, explain that lost in translation? Or are they, to your point, obviously, are they just kind of enamored or still believe in the old Democratic narrative, or just kind of, blindly, without looking at the reality that the bipartisanship really has eroded in many ways, shapes, or form that we're seeing today play out in the American Jewish community?
Yeah, I think that first of all, this is understandable denial. You don't want to see how bad it is, and once that 4 years ago there was just a squad, but now it looks like the presidential candidate and her VP candidate, who just praised Ilhan Omar, they are reorienting themselves to the Hamas supporters in the party, and that's very difficult for Jews to process. And of course they're trying to prevent Jews from processing this by maneuvers that designed to disguise the radicalization of the Democratic Party from their Jewish voters. Look what they do. Kamala Harris appointed Ilan Goldenberg to be her point man for relations with the Jewish community. This is one of the people who pushed and organized sanctions against Israelis, and putting in place a mechanism. And as Mike Doran has pointed out, though America has sanctioned countries and people for policies they didn't like, they put in place a mechanism of sanction that churns out invented excuses for sanctions over settlers in Israel. And it also, it was at least suggested that they will sanction a minister in the government and a unit in the army. Think of how undermining of Israel's sovereignty the very idea is. The IDF has a chain of command. If anyone in the IDF does something that America is not happy with, the organization you should address it is the government of Israel, which is in charge of the army, which is in charge of a unit. You don't reach under a government, an allied government sovereignty, and sanction a specific unit in its government. What you do if you do this is you disrupt the chain of command. So soldiers in the Israeli army should be looking to the American president for permission to do what they do, or should they look to their commanders? You risk fraying the chain of command of an allied army. And so Ilan Goldenberg was a major player in constructing that mechanism. He's an anti-Israeli candidate, and yet he has a name, Goldenberg. He's Jewish. He's an ex-Israeli. So we're supposed to be calmed by that fact. I think it is our task now not to be duped, and to say this out loud, and to call them out on what they are doing. And I think that Israel has a role to play in that. I think Netanyahu's speech before the joint session of the two houses of Congress was a clarion call in this respect. He did not say that the American administration is appeasing Iran. To the contrary, he pretended that it's not, by saying that there is an international coalition against Iran led by Israel, by saying that this is a war that Israel and the United States and the Western democracies are all part of, and that Israel is spearheading. But this is also a hint that if the American policy of appeasing Iran goes too far, we will call it out. And calling it out can cause some serious damage. Now, let me just address in this context what would happen if Kamala Harris does win the election and the policy of appeasing Iran continues. Well, as I said, this is a danger to the existence of Israel, but Israel is not out of cards in playing that game. And so, since this policy is suicidal in every respect, and since if continued, it will lead to a regional war that it purports to be able to prevent, then in that war, the United States will find it very hard to just join the Iranian, Chinese, Russian side of this equation. So if things come to a head, then they can also lead to the breakdown of the American policy. And if Israel would face the prospect of a second Holocaust, then, and I'm phrasing this argument carefully, then everything is on the table. Then Israel would do anything to prevent a second Holocaust, and by anything I mean anything. And this is a whole lot of trouble for everyone else. So we will never again means that we will not go down with a whimper if we face existential danger.
Great, thank you. Alex, another question for you?
Sure. Let's back up from the from the apocalypse a little bit. And one of the striking things about the situation in Gaza, the war in Gaza, and has been that Americans purport to draw red lines which are designed to defend the status quo, as you pointed out, and then these are routinely crossed for perfectly valid tactical and strategic reasons by Israel. And now the Ukrainians have begun to do the same thing, as seeing that their war, which has been constrained by American micromanagement of various sorts of supplies, of tactics, of long-term strategy, has been to their disadvantage. So one could argue certainly that the next 6 months is an especially dangerous period for the world as a whole. But I wonder if there's a lesson to come out of this that that's historical, that during the 1950s, when the U.S.-Israel relationship was not close, Israel had far greater tactical and strategic leeway to develop allies, to develop sources of weapons supplies, to develop its own industries. Let's leave the situation of Suez a kind of strange interlude, post late imperial exercise on the part of Israel, Britain, and France in particular. But Israel developed a nuclear program. It developed its own aviation industry and munitions industry. And similar kinds of moves are underway now. So my larger point is, maybe this special relationship is a bad thing. Maybe this special relationship needs to be loosened for everybody's sake. And that really will allow America to disengage itself from the Middle East and let the locals fight it out. Will the fetish of Palestinian nationalism drive America to remain involved until some kind of bitter end, or can everybody let go in some way?
Well, I hope to preserve the special relations with the United States. I think that we should aspire to a situation in which the United States will change its policy and help Israel defeat the Iranian axis. Iran has been tying a noose around our necks, around Israel's neck, surrounding it with proxy forces, and the right tactic to defeat us, which is using cheap drones and rockets to saturate our defense system, which is also very expensive, from all sides until we collapse under the economic and security strain. I don't think we should happily go it alone, but I do think we should start manufacturing our own ammunition. And I think that without breaking relations, there's great importance in the fact that we defied American dictates in this war, because the Iranians were hiding behind the wall of that America created by restraining Israel. And as long as Israel abided by the American vetoes, then the Iranians knew exactly how far they can go and rely on America restraining Israeli retaliation. We saw that in April, when on the 13th of April, on the night between 13th and 14th of April, Iran launched the largest missile barrage in the history of the world on Israel, missiles and drones, and Israel intercepted almost all of them. And then the Biden administration said, take that win, as if interception is a win, and did not exact a price from Iran, and Israel did only something symbolic. When Israel began to act more aggressively, they signaled to the Iranians that we can do great damage. The demonstration was in Yemen when the Houthis managed to get a drone into Tel Aviv, and one person was killed in that attack. Then Israel did not just attack, Houthi rocket launchers. We attacked a seaport through which the oil industry and the arms industry operate their import and export, and the port burned for many days. And so the Iranians, and then there was the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in the middle of Tehran. Israel did not take responsibility, but the Iranians think that this was done by the Israeli. So if you connect the two, then you realize that Israel is signaling to Iran that we can hurt the Iranian economy very badly, and this can destabilize the regime. So the way that we have regained our deterrence is by signaling to our enemies that America is not going to be able to restrain us when it comes to our vital interests. All this without breaking relations. So I don't think that when the relation is not an even partnership. There's one huge, strong superpower and one relatively small country, which is only a superpower in its own region, maybe, or just a power in its own region. But that does not mean that we have to behave like a vassal state. And because if we do, nobody will take us into our interest into account, and nobody will negotiate with us. People will think that the anything you want from Israel, you have to go to Washington for. And we need to prevent that, because we need to prevent our autonomy, and we need to preserve our room of maneuver, and we have to preserve above all our deterrence.
Great. Well, I think that's a good place to kind of sum up where we are. I mean, obviously there's a lot to still unpack here, and obviously everything is fluid. So Gadi, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us this afternoon. Alex, for joining me as always. For everybody who joined us this afternoon and taking the time, it's here we're ending towards the summer, at the end of the summer break, so people are slowly coming back into what life will look like back on campuses where many of our members live. So hopefully you can come back and discuss more as we elevate, as things amplify and accelerate as we move towards November here. But we appreciate you taking the time to talk to us this afternoon. And
thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
It's wonderful having you. And of course, we'll be in touch. Please be on the lookout for future webinars. There'll be more notices coming out in the next few days. And
Asaf, please send the link to Batya Unger Sargon, which I sent you on the chat here.
I will do that. I will pass it along in the follow-up email to everybody else. So thank you again, everybody. Everybody's staying safe and enjoying the last days of summer. And we will all talk soon. So have a good day. And Gadi, to you, good evening, and we will talk soon.
Thank you.